Chapter 1. The Echo of Silver and Cedar. The rusted key groaned within the lock, a high-pitched protest that vibrated through Elara's fingertips and echoed into the silence of the surrounding pines. She leaned her shoulder against the swollen wood, shoving until the door gave way with a violent shudder, spilling her into the stale, shadowed air of her mother's sanctuary. Dust motes danced in the singular shafts of gray afternoon light, settling upon furniture draped in white sheets like a gathering of ghosts. This cabin was supposed to be a tomb for her past, a place where the whispers of the Blackthorn Pack couldn't reach her ears or sting her pride. Every floorboard she stepped upon offered a hollow thud, a rhythmic reminder of the public rejection that still burned like caustic acid in the back of her throat. Memories of that night clawed at her mind, sharper than any claw or tooth. She could still see the sneer on the beta's face as he announced her unworthiness, the way the crowd parted as if she carried a plague, and her mother's slumped shoulders in the background. Her mother had served them with bowed head and quiet grace, only to watch her daughter be discarded like yesterday's refuse. Why had she come back to the edge of their territory? Perhaps because the pain of isolation was easier to manage than the exhaustion of running from a fate that had already branded her a failure. Drawing a jagged breath, Elara dropped her heavy canvas bag onto the floor, the sound booming in the oppressive stillness. The air here tasted of cedar, old paper, and a faint, lingering trace of dried lavender that made her eyes sting with sudden, unwelcome moisture. She began to strip the sheets from the couch, her movements frantic and jerky, as if physical labor could outrun the internal monologue screaming that she was fundamentally unloved. She claimed to hate the idea of fated mates, calling the bond a tether for the weak, yet the hollow ache in her chest told a different story. If she truly didn't care, why did the silence of this forest feel like a judgment? Moving toward the small kitchenette, she noticed a glass of water sitting on the counter, the liquid inside clear and free of dust. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Someone had been here recently, violating the one border she thought was sacred. She reached for the small silver blade tucked into her boot, her pulse drumming a frantic rhythm in her ears. Was she being followed by the same wolves who laughed as she was exiled? Or was this something more sinister, a predator lurking in the sanctuary of a dead woman's home? As she edged toward the bedroom, a scent began to unravel the iron grip she held on her composure. It wasn't the smell of decay or pine, but something deep, primal, and intoxicatingly masculine. It smelled of a thunderstorm breaking over a scorched earth, heavy with ozone and musk. The closer she got to the door, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing against her skin with a heat that made her blood simmer. Her hand shook as she reached for the handle, her instincts screaming a warning that her heart was already beginning to ignore. She pushed the door open, her gaze landing on the bed where a massive, shirtless figure lay sprawled in a sleep so deep it seemed predatory. Chapter 2. The Intruder in the Sheets. The man lying amidst the tangled quilts was a landscape of jagged scars and corded muscle, his bronze skin glowing in the amber twilight filtering through the window. Elara froze, her silver blade glinting as she held it aloft, though her grip felt increasingly useless against the sheer presence of the intruder. This was Kael, the ruthless alpha, whose name was whispered like a curse in the lowlands, a man known for ruling with a fist of iron and a heart of frost. Seeing him here, vulnerable and yet utterly dominant even in sleep, sent a jolt of electricity through her that nearly knocked her breathless. It was the mate bond, a tether of golden fire that snapped into place the moment her eyes locked onto his resting form. Because she had spent years convincing herself she was unworthy of such a connection, the sudden arrival of the bond felt like an insult rather than a gift. She wanted to scream at the universe for its cruel timing, for choosing a tyrant to be the answer to her secret prayers. Kael shifted, the movement fluid and dangerous, his chest rising and falling with a slow, deliberate cadence. He was the embodiment of everything she loathed: authority, power, and the terrifying capacity to abandon those who didn't serve his purpose. Yet, the scent of him was pulling her forward, a siren song that promised a heat she had never dared to imagine. Suddenly, those golden eyes snapped open, locking onto hers with a predatory intensity that pinned her to the spot. There was no grogginess in his gaze, only a sharp, lethal intelligence that assessed her in a heartbeat. He didn't move to attack. Instead, he inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of her skin. A low vibration started in his throat, a sound that wasn't quite a growl but something far more intimate. It was the sound of a beast recognizing its missing half, a frequency that resonated in the marrow of Elara's bones. "Why do you smell like mine?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp that sent shivers racing down her spine. He sat up slowly, the muscles in his back rippling like a disturbed pool of water, his presence expanding until the room felt too small to contain them both. Elara forced her feet to remain planted, refusing to show the tremor that threatened to undo her. "This is my mother's cabin, and you are trespassing in a bed that doesn't belong to you," she countered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in her lungs. She watched as his gaze dropped to the silver blade in her hand, a mocking smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't fear the metal. He feared the way she was looking at him, as if he were a monster he hadn't yet realized he'd become. How could fate be so twisted as to bring the most feared wolf in the territories to this humble, broken-down shanty? Kael stood, his height towering over her, cutting off the light and leaving them in a private, heated darkness. He took a step toward her, and for the first time in her life, Elara didn't want to run. She wanted to know if the fire in his eyes would burn her or finally keep her warm. The air between them crackled with an unspoken challenge, a silent war of wills that neither was prepared to lose. Chapter 3. The Law of the Wild. Kael reached out, his fingers stopping just inches from her jaw, the heat radiating from his hand enough to make her skin prickle. "Legality is a concept for the weak, little wolf," he rumbled, his eyes never leaving hers. "In these woods, possession is determined by strength, and I have found nothing here but dust and your intoxicating scent." He spoke with the arrogance of a king, yet there was a flicker of something else behind the gold. A weariness that suggested his crown was made of thorns. He had spent his life building walls to protect a pack that feared him, learning the hard way that softness was a luxury he couldn't afford. Transitioning from shock to cold fury, Elara batted his hand away, the silver blade flashing between them as a warning. "I am not a member of your pack, and I am certainly not your possession," she hissed, her eyes bright with the fire of a woman who had already lost everything once. She wouldn't let him see the way her heart galloped at his proximity, or how much she craved the touch she had just rejected. The world had told her she was a weapon to be used, or a shame to be hidden, and she would not let this alpha prove them right. Because she had survived the humiliation of the Blackthorn rejection, she knew how to recognize a hunter when she saw one. Kael wasn't just an intruder. He was a catalyst for a war she wasn't ready to fight. He watched her with a mixture of amusement and growing intrigue, his posture shifting from aggressive to predatory curiosity. He had expected a frightened girl, but he had found a queen in exile, a woman whose spirit was as sharp as the steel she held. The cabin, once a place of quiet mourning, had transformed into a battlefield where the stakes were their very souls. A distant howl fractured the tension, a long, mournful sound that carried the scent of blood and silver on the wind. Kael's expression hardened instantly, his playful arrogance vanishing to be replaced by the cold mask of a commander. He turned his head toward the window, his ears twitching as he tracked the movement in the treeline. Those weren't the howls of his own men. They were the sharp, frantic yaps of mercenaries, hunters who didn't care for pack laws or mate bonds. Someone had followed Elara, or perhaps they had been waiting for the alpha to show a moment of weakness. "They are here for you," Kael said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he looked back at her. He didn't ask if she was ready. He simply reached for his leather jacket, his movements efficient and grim. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage that the world was about to set on fire. Elara felt the first stirrings of true terror, not of the hunters outside, but of the fact that Kael was the only thing standing between her and a second final destruction. Would he protect her because the bond demanded it, Or would he leave her to the wolves the moment the cost became too high? Would you trust the man who rules through fear to keep your heart safe when the shadows start to bleed? The forest grew deathly silent as the first shadow crossed the porch, a precursor to the violence that was about to erupt. Kael's eyes shifted, the gold bleeding into a dark lupine amber that signaled the coming change. He stepped in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole, a silent vow that the ground would drink blood before they took another step toward his mate. Chapter 4: The Symphony of Bone and Blade. Heavy silence hung in the air for a fraction of a heartbeat before the front door exploded inward, splintering into 1,000 jagged shards of oak. Kael did not hesitate, his body launching forward with a roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin and rattled the glass in the window frames. He shifted mid-air, a violent and breathtaking transition of snapping bone and erupting fur that turned the man into a nightmare of silver-gray muscle. The first assassin, a man clad in tactical gear and wielding a silver-tipped spear, barely had time to scream before Kael's jaws clamped around his throat with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the white sheets Elara had just uncovered, staining her sanctuary with the copper tang of impending death. Because the trauma of her past had taught her that protection always came with a hidden price, Elara felt a wave of nausea compete with the adrenaline surging through her veins. She watched Kael move like a hurricane of teeth and claws, a blurring shadow that dismantled the intruders with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. He wasn't just fighting, he was erasing them, his every movement a testament to the ruthless power that had made him the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories. She gripped her silver dagger until her knuckles turned ivory, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she realized that the isolation she sought was gone forever. The world had found her, and it had brought a monster to keep the other monsters at bay. Fresh waves of attackers poured through the broken threshold, their eyes gleaming with the unnatural light of silver-laced weaponry designed to fell even the strongest shifter. Kael took a hit, a silver-edged blade slicing across his flank, and the smell of burning flesh filled the room, making Elara's stomach churn. She saw the alpha stagger, a low, pained whine vibrating in his chest, and something inside her snapped, a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. She leaped forward, shoving her dagger into the kidney of a hunter aiming a crossbow at Kael's head, her movements fueled by a primal desperation. She had spent her life feeling like a victim of fate, but in this moment of blood and fire, she chose to be a participant in her own survival. Kael spun, his massive paw swatting another man across the room with enough force to crack the log walls, his amber eyes locking onto Elara with a mix of fury and shocked recognition. He hadn't expected the weak exile to draw blood, yet there she stood, splattered in crimson and breathing like a dragon. The remaining hunters, seeing their numbers dwindle against the combined ferocity of a maddened alpha and a vengeful woman, retreated into the darkness of the pines. Kael didn't chase them. Instead, he shifted back into his human form, his naked skin covered in sweat, soot, and the gore of his enemies. He stood over the bodies, his chest heaving as he looked down at Elara with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "You don't get hunted while I breathe," he growled, the vow hanging in the air like an unbreakable contract. He reached out to touch her face, his fingers stained with the lifeblood of those who had tried to kill her, and for the first time, Elara didn't flinch. She saw the vulnerability in his gaze, a crack in the tyrant's mask that suggested he was just as terrified of the bond as she was. They were tied together now, not just by the whims of destiny, but by the shared weight of the lives they had just taken. Chapter 5: The Weight of Political Blood. Transitioning from the heat of battle to the cold reality of the aftermath, Kael began to pace the small kitchen, his movements jerky and filled with a restless energy. He ignored the silver burn on his side, though the skin was blistering and angry, a clear sign that the hunters were professionals backed by someone with deep pockets. He stopped at the window, staring out into the oppressive darkness of the forest, as if he could see the puppet master pulling the strings. Elara watched him, her mind racing through the implications of the attack, her hands still trembling as she tried to wipe the blood from her blade. She was a weapon again, a piece on a chessboard she hadn't agreed to play on, and the realization tasted like ash. "The rival Alpha, Silas, wants you for more than just a trophy," Kael said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that filled the quiet cabin. He turned to look at her, the moonlight catching the hard angles of his face and the grim set of his jaw. "He knows about the purity of your lineage, the healing properties in your blood that the Blackthorn Pack tried to hide when they discarded you." He spoke the truth she had buried deep within her soul, the secret reason her mother had kept her in the shadows for so long. She wasn't just an illegitimate child. She was a biological anomaly, a source of power that could tip the scales of pack warfare. Because she felt the familiar sting of being used, Elara's defensive walls slammed back into place with a resounding thud. "So that's why you're here," she spat, her voice laced with a bitterness that made Kael flinch. "You don't want a mate. You want a walking apothecary to keep your warriors on their feet while you conquer the world." She moved to grab her bag, her only thought being to run until her lungs gave out, to find a place where no one knew her name or the value of her blood. She would rather die in the cold than be a tool for another man's ambition, even if that man's scent made her soul ache with longing. Kael was across the room in a heartbeat, his hand slamming against the doorframe to block her exit, his body a solid wall of heat and muscle. "You think so little of me?" he asked, his voice cracking with a raw emotion that caught her off guard. "I have enough power to flatten Silas and everyone who follows him, but I have never had a reason to care if I survived the process until I walked into this cabin." He wasn't talking about politics or bloodlines. He was talking about the hollow space in his chest that she had started to fill the moment she looked at him. He was a tyrant who had forgotten how to be a man, and she was the only one who could remind him. The standoff lasted an eternity, their breaths mingling in the small space between them, the tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. Elara looked into his eyes and saw the truth. He was terrified that she would leave him to face the darkness alone. She saw the little boy who had watched his father fail, the leader who had carried the weight of 1,000 lives on his shoulders, and the mate who was desperate to be chosen. She didn't want to stay, but the thought of leaving him felt like tearing out her own heart. She was trapped in a cage of his making, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she wanted the key. Chapter 6. The Covenant of Shadows. Transitioning from defiance to a weary acceptance, Elara finally dropped her bag, the sound of it hitting the floor signaling a temporary surrender. She wouldn't kneel, and she wouldn't surrender her heart, but she would accept his protection until the immediate threat was neutralized. "I will stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the broken door. "But only until Silas is dealt with, and only if you understand that I am not yours to command." She met his gaze with a fierce intensity, a silent warning that she would burn the whole world down before she let him become her master. Kael nodded, a slow, solemn movement that felt like the sealing of a blood pact. "Fair enough, little wolf," he murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, keeping her close while the world demanded her blood, but he couldn't bring himself to let her go. He reached for a heavy blanket and draped it over her shoulders, his touch lingering just a second too long to be purely platonic. He was marking her in his own way, claiming her space and her time, even if he couldn't yet claim her heart. Because the council would soon learn of her presence, Kael knew their time in the cabin was drawing to a close. He would have to take her back to Blackthorn territory, into the heart of the pack that had once whispered about her mother's shame. He watched her as she sat by the cold hearth, her eyes distant and filled with a haunting sadness. She was a co-alpha in the making, though she didn't know it yet. A woman who would either save his pack or be the catalyst for its total destruction. The hooks of destiny were digging deep, and there was no way to pull them out without shedding blood. Would the pack accept a woman they had once shunned, or would they see her as a curse brought home by their ruthless leader? Elara looked up at him, her silhouette framed by the jagged edges of the broken door, looking like a goddess of war and grief. She was the open loop in his perfectly ordered life, the variable he couldn't control and the treasure he couldn't hide. He knew that by taking her home, he was starting a war that could cost him everything: his crown, his pack, and his life. But as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, he knew he would do it all again just to see her stand tall in the face of the storm. "Pack your things," Kael said, his voice firm and devoid of the tenderness from a moment before. "We leave for Blackthorn at first light, and I suggest you find your pride, Elara. You're going to need it where we're going." He walked away to prepare the horses, leaving her alone with the ghosts of her mother's cabin and the terrifying new reality of her life. She was no longer in exile. She was the mate of a king, and the world was coming to take her crown before she even had the chance to wear it. Chapter 7. The Valley of Whispers. The journey into the heart of Blackthorn territory felt like a slow descent into a cold, beautiful nightmare. Every rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves against the frosted earth sounded like a countdown to a confrontation Elara had spent a decade trying to avoid. She rode slightly behind Kael, her eyes fixed on the broad expanse of his back, watching the way his muscles shifted beneath his leather jacket with every movement. He was a silent sentinel, a wall of living granite that she both resented and relied upon as the air grew heavy with the scent of 1,000 wolves. This was the seat of power she had been taught to fear, a place where the air tasted of ancient pine and the iron-rich tang of a dominant pack. Because the memories of her childhood humiliation were etched into her very bones, Elara felt the weight of every hidden pair of eyes as they crossed the border. Wolves stepped out from the shadows of the massive stone pillars marking the entrance to the village, their gazes sharp and judgmental as they recognized the woman beside their alpha. The whispers began almost immediately, a low, buzzing static of disapproval that rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. They remembered the girl who served their meals with downcast eyes, and they certainly remembered the day she was cast out for the crime of being born to a mother who loved the wrong man. Elara felt the familiar urge to shrink, to tuck her chin and disappear into the folds of her cloak. But a sudden, sharp memory of Kael's blood on her cabin floor stopped her cold. Transitioning from a victim to a survivor, she straightened her spine, tilting her chin up until the light caught the defiance in her amber eyes. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her bleed, not when she carried the mark of the most powerful man in the region. Kael slowed his mount, pulling his horse even with hers in a gesture that was as much a warning to his people as it was a comfort to her. He didn't say a word, but the growl vibrating in his chest was audible to everyone within 20 yards, a primal frequency that demanded silence. The whispers died down, replaced by a tense, suffocating stillness that made the hair on the back of Elara's neck stand on end. She was a stranger in a land that should have been her home, a ghost returning to haunt the living. They reached the Great Hall, a massive structure of timber and stone that seemed to grow out of the mountain itself, its doors thrown wide to reveal the flickering orange glow of a dozen hearths. Kael dismounted with a fluid grace that spoke of a man who was always ready for a fight, reaching up to assist Elara with a gentleness that felt like a betrayal of his ruthless reputation. His touch was a brief flash of heat against her palms, a reminder of the bond that hummed between them like a live wire. As they walked toward the entrance, a tall, scarred warrior stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in Elara's presence. This was Silas's shadow, a messenger who had no business being in the heart of Blackthorn unless a challenge was being issued. "The council is waiting, Alpha," the warrior rumbled, his voice like grinding stones, his gaze lingering on Elara with a predatory hunger that made her skin crawl. "And they are not pleased to find a stray in the company of our king." Kael didn't blink, his expression remaining as cold and impenetrable as a frozen lake, yet the air around him seemed to drop several degrees in temperature. He didn't answer the man. He simply tightened his grip on Elara's elbow and pushed past him, dragging her into the lion's den of pack politics. The open loop of her past was finally coming full circle, and she wasn't sure if she was the hunter or the prey in this new, dangerous game. Chapter 8. The Alchemist's Burden. The council chamber was a pit of shadows and judgment, filled with the oldest and most traditional wolves of the Blackthorn line. They sat in a semicircle of high-backed chairs, their faces illuminated by the dying embers of a central fire, looking like a jury of ancient gods. Elara felt the pressure of their collective gaze, a physical force that tried to beat her down to her knees, but she stood her ground beside Kael. She could smell their fear, a sour metallic scent that they tried to hide behind masks of arrogance and disdain. They didn't just hate her for her birth. They feared her for the power they knew she carried in her veins, a power that made her more than just a wolf. Transitioning from a silent observer to a focal point of conflict, Elara watched as Kael stepped into the center of the ring, his presence commanding the room without him uttering a single syllable. He wasn't there to ask for permission. He was there to dictate terms, a fact that clearly sat poorly with the elders. One of the women, a silver-haired matron with eyes as sharp as obsidian, leaned forward, her voice a whip crack in the silence. "You bring the healer's daughter into this sacred space, Kael? Have you forgotten why her mother was silenced? Have you forgotten the instability her blood brings to our borders?" Her words were a direct assault on Elara's worth, a reminder that her very existence was considered a threat to the status quo. Because the injustice of the accusation burned hotter than any silver, Elara stepped forward before Kael could intervene, her voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even her. "My mother was silenced because she knew how to mend what you insist on breaking," she stated, her gaze locking onto the matrons with unwavering intensity. "And if you think my blood is an instability, then perhaps you should look at the warriors dying in your infirmary while you argue over lineage." The room erupted into a cacophony of outraged shouts and snarls, the elders bristling at the perceived insolence of a commoner. Kael let out a sharp, bone-chilling whistle that cut through the noise, his eyes glowing with a lethal amber light that promised violence to the next person who spoke. Suddenly, the heavy doors at the back of the chamber swung open, and a group of warriors carried in a stretcher bearing a young wolf whose chest had been torn open by a silver-tipped claw. The smell of decay and burning fur filled the room, a visceral reminder of the war Silas was waging on their borders. The pack's healers hovered nearby, their faces pale and helpless, their traditional medicines failing against the specialized poison of the rival Alpha. Elara didn't wait for an invitation. She moved toward the dying man, her instincts overriding her fear as she saw the life fading from his eyes. She was a weapon, yes, but she was also a restorer, and she would not watch a man die just to prove a point to a group of bitter old wolves. "Move," she commanded, her voice vibrating with a power that made the healers stumble back in shock. She knelt beside the warrior, her hands hovering over the jagged wound as she focused on the heat rising in her own blood, a golden energy that seemed to hum beneath her skin. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, allowing a single drop of her blood to fall into the open gash, watching as the silver rot began to retreat. The room went deathly silent as the warrior's breathing leveled out, the flesh beginning to knit together before their very eyes in a display of impossible grace. Kael watched her with an expression of profound awe, a realization dawning on him that he hadn't just found a mate, he had found the savior of his people. Chapter 9. The Herald of War. Transitioning from a moment of miraculous healing to the cold reality of impending slaughter, the heavy atmosphere of the chamber was shattered by a frantic messenger bursting through the main gates. The man was covered in soot and blood, his breath coming in jagged gasps as he collapsed at Kael's feet, clutching a scroll sealed with the obsidian wax of the rival Alpha. The healing of the warrior had proved Elara's worth, but it had also painted a massive, glowing target on her back that Silas was more than ready to strike. Kael took the scroll, his fingers trembling slightly as he broke the seal, his eyes scanning the elegant, cruel script that demanded the surrender of the healer mate, or the total annihilation of the Blackthorn Pack. "Silas is at the border," Kael announced, his voice a low, hollow sound that echoed through the stunned silence of the council. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperate love and agonizing guilt, knowing that he had brought her into a situation that might very well be her execution. The stakes had risen beyond a simple territorial dispute. This was a fight for the future of the shifter race, and Elara was the prize at the center of the storm. The elders who had just witnessed her power now looked at her with a new kind of hunger, not for her blood, but for the safety she could provide their sons and daughters. They were ready to use her as a shield, a realization that made Elara's heart turn to ice. Because she could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her, Elara realized that her goal of surviving without emotional surrender was becoming an impossible dream. She couldn't watch these people die for her, even if they had once treated her like dirt, and she certainly couldn't watch Kael march into a war he might not win. She stood tall in the center of the hall, the blood of the healed warrior still staining her hands, a symbol of the life she could give and the death she could cause. She was no longer just an exile or a mate. She was the axis upon which the world was beginning to turn, and the pressure was enough to crack the strongest soul. "He won't stop until he has me," Elara said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her heart as she looked at Kael. "And we both know that if he takes me, he will use my blood to create an army that no pack can stand against." She wasn't just a weapon. She was the ultimate prize in a game of global dominance, and the realization was a heavy, suffocating shroud. Kael stepped toward her, his hand reaching out to cup her jaw, his touch the only thing keeping her grounded in the swirling chaos of the room. He didn't say he would save her. He said he would fight beside her, a distinction that made all the difference in her fraying world. Would Kael choose his pack over his mate when the silver started to fly, or would he burn his kingdom to the ground just to keep her safe? The council members began to argue again, their voices rising in a frantic tide of fear and greed, but Elara only had eyes for the alpha who was looking at her like she was the only light in a darkening universe. The first act of their tragedy was over, and the second was beginning with the sound of war drums echoing from the distant mountains. The hooks were set, the lines were drawn, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elara knew that the girl who had entered the cabin would never be the woman who survived the night. Chapter 10. The Strategist's Shadow. The heavy oak table in the war room was covered in maps of topographical veins and obsidian markers, each representing a movement of Silas's encroaching forces. Kael stood at the head of the table, but he wasn't barking orders at his generals. Instead, he was waiting, his eyes fixed on Elara as she traced the river line with a slender finger. This was a shift that sent ripples of unease through the seasoned warriors flanking the walls, a silent acknowledgement that the woman they once considered a liability was now the architect of their survival. Transitioning from a protected asset to a core decision-maker, Elara felt the weight of their lives pressing against her skin, a heavy mantle that she accepted with a grim, newfound clarity. Because she had spent years navigating the treacherous social hierarchies of the pack as an outcast, she saw the battlefield through the lens of psychology rather than just brute force. She pointed to a narrow gorge where the shadows pooled like ink, a place the soldiers had dismissed as too treacherous for a main assault. "He won't come through the valley where we expect him, because Silas doesn't want a fair fight. He wants a spectacle," she murmured, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. She looked up, meeting Kael's intense gaze, and for the first time she saw herself reflected not as a mate to be shielded, but as an equal to be consulted. This was the first true crack in her armor of unworthiness, a realization that her mind was as valuable as the blood in her veins. Kael leaned over the map, his hand resting dangerously close to hers, the heat of his presence a constant grounding hum in the frantic atmosphere. "If we move the 3rd Battalion here, we leave the southern flank exposed," he countered, though his tone was inquisitive rather than dismissive. He was testing her, pushing her to see the full scope of the chess match they were playing against a man who had no soul. Elara didn't flinch, her mind working through the variables with a speed that made her pulse thrum in her throat. She wasn't just planning a defense, she was learning the rhythm of Kael's leadership, discovering that beneath his tyrannical reputation lay a man who craved a partner capable of standing in the fire beside him. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Blackthorn range, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, fueled by reports of smoke on the horizon. The warriors filed out to take their positions, leaving Elara and Kael alone in the flickering light of the dying hearth. The silence that followed was thick with the unsaid, a bridge of electricity that spanned the distance between them. Transitioning from the cold logic of war to the raw vulnerability of their connection, Kael stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her against the stone wall. He didn't speak of battle plans or troop movements. He spoke of the terror of losing the only thing that had made his cold world feel warm again. "You see things I have missed for a decade," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made her marrow ache. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a prayer. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her pride warring with the desperate need to be held. She had spent so long convinced that love was a trap designed to humiliate her. Yet here was the most powerful man she had ever known, looking at her with a reverence that felt like a rebirth. The question of her worth was no longer a whisper in her mind. It was a roar in her blood, challenging her to believe in a destiny she hadn't chosen but was finally ready to claim. Chapter 11. The Orchestrated Ruin. The air in the archives was thick with the scent of moldering parchment and ancient secrets, a place where the history of the Blackthorn Pack was buried beneath layers of dust and lies. Elara moved through the stacks with a lantern held high, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm as she searched for the truth behind her mother's exile. Kael had given her the key to the restricted scrolls, a gesture of trust that felt like a heavy crown, and because she needed to know the why of her pain before she could face the how of her future, she dug through the records of her birth. She found a ledger bound in cracked black leather, the ink faded, but the words still carrying the weight of a death sentence. Transitioning from suspicion to a soul-shattering realization, she read the correspondence between her former Pack Alpha and the man who was now her greatest enemy. Her rejection hadn't been an act of Pack law or a judgment of her character. It had been a cold, calculated transaction. Silas had wanted her even then, and the Blackthorn leadership had orchestrated her public humiliation to break her spirit, making her easier to capture when she eventually fled into the wilderness. She wasn't discarded because she was unworthy. She was discarded because she was too valuable to keep without a fight. The humiliation that had defined her life was a fabrication, a political play that used her mother's reputation as the ultimate smokescreen. The betrayal felt like a silver blade through her ribs, leaving her breathless and reeling in the dark of the archives. She had spent 10 years hating herself for a failure that was actually a testament to her importance, a revelation that turned her entire world upside down. Because the anger was more manageable than the grief, she felt a cold, hard flame ignite in her chest, a desire for vengeance that surpassed her need for survival. She wasn't just a healer or a mate. She was a victim of a grand conspiracy, and the men who had orchestrated her ruin were still out there, waiting to claim the prize they had spent a decade molding. Kael found her there, hunched over the ledger with tears of rage shimmering in her eyes, his expression turning to stone as he realized what she had discovered. He didn't offer platitudes or excuses for the men who had come before him. He simply knelt at her feet, his large hands covering her trembling ones. "I didn't know," he rasped, his voice thick with a fury that matched her own. "If I had known they bartered your soul like a piece of livestock, I would have burned this hall to the ground years ago." He wasn't just an alpha in that moment. He was a man witnessing the desecration of the woman he loved, and the pain in his eyes was the first true mirror of her own. The game had changed, shifting from a defensive war to a personal crusade for justice. Elara looked at Kael, and for the first time, she didn't see a tyrant or a savior. She saw a partner in the coming storm. The revelation of the orchestrated rejection had stripped away her last reason to run, replacing her fear with a lethal, focused purpose. She would not be bait, and she would not be a weapon in Silas's hands. She would be the fire that consumed the old world to make room for the new. The open loop of her past had been closed with a snap of bone, and as she stood up, the archives felt like a tomb she was finally ready to leave behind. Chapter 12. The Fragility of a King. Transitioning from the cold clarity of betrayal to the simmering heat of the front lines, the atmosphere in the Blackthorn camp was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Kael spent the hours before dawn inspecting the fortifications, but his movements were lacked their usual mechanical precision, a subtle tremor in his hands betraying the toll the secrets were taking on him. He had spent his life believing that strength was found in isolation, yet the more he allowed Elara into his mind, the more he felt the terrifying fragility of his own heart. Because he had never learned how to love without the fear of destruction, the depth of his bond with Elara felt like a vulnerability Silas was already preparing to exploit. He stood on the battlements, watching the distant lights of the rival camp, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. A messenger arrived with a severed wolf's head, a gruesome calling card from Silas that carried a note pinned to the ear with a silver needle. The message was a direct jab at Kael's control, suggesting that a tyrant could never truly protect a mate who had already been broken by her own people. Kael nearly lost control, his eyes flashing a brilliant, dangerous gold as a low, rumbling snarl ripped from his throat, a sound that made the nearby sentries scramble for cover. He was a man on the edge of a primal breakdown, his fear for Elara threatening to drown the strategic mind that had kept his pack safe for so long. Elara found him there, her hand resting on the small of his back, a touch that acted like a grounding wire for his spiraling rage. She saw the cracks in the king, the way the pressure was warping the very foundation of his identity, and she realized that she was the only one who could keep him from shattering. "He wants you to lose your mind, Kael," she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the storm of his emotions. "He wants you to be the monster the world thinks you are, because a monster is easy to predict." She wasn't just his mate. She was his conscience, the voice of reason in a world that was screaming for blood. The vulnerability between them was a new kind of battlefield, one where the stakes were their shared sanity. Kael turned to her, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that knocked the air from her lungs, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He smelled of sweat, steel, and a deep, aching loneliness that made Elara's heart break for the man behind the crown. In this moment of pre-dawn stillness, they weren't alphas or healers. They were two souls clinging to each other in the face of an inevitable catastrophe. The love that had started as a spark of chemistry had transformed into a profound emotional bond, a tether that would either pull them through the war or drag them both into the abyss. Would their connection be enough to withstand the physical and psychological assault Silas was about to launch? Or would the weight of their combined traumas prove too much to bear? The first horn of the enemy sounded in the distance, a long, low blast that signaled the start of the engagement. Kael pulled back, his eyes searching hers for a final moment of reassurance before he donned the mask of the commander once more. The climb was reaching its peak, and as they looked out over the darkened valley, they both knew that the morning would bring a transformation that no one was prepared for. The stakes were no longer just their lives, but the very definition of what it meant to be chosen. Chapter 13. The Altar of the Pack. The sun hung low and heavy in a sky the color of a bruised plum as Elara stepped onto the raised stone dais of the Blackthorn Plaza. 1,000 eyes tracked her every movement, a sea of amber and gold reflecting the torchlight that flickered against the darkening mountain peaks. This was the summit of her transformation, the moment where the whispers of her past would either be silenced or become a deafening roar. Because she had spent her life hiding from the judgment of the pack, the act of standing beside Kael in full view of his subjects felt like exposing her throat to 1,000 blades. She could feel the pulse of the bond thrumming between them, a golden cord of electricity that anchored her to the earth when her legs threatened to give way. Transitioning from a hidden secret to a public declaration, Kael took her hand in his grip firm and possessive, sending a jolt of heat through her veins that stilled her trembling. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her, his eyes burning with a pride that made the last of her unworthiness wither like a dying leaf. "They need to see that you are not a guest, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "They need to see that the heart of Blackthorn doesn't just beat in my chest, but in yours as well." This wasn't just a political alliance. It was a coronation of the spirit, a commitment made in the face of a world that was screaming for their separation. The silence that followed his declaration was thick enough to choke on, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. Elara looked out at the faces of the people who had once treated her mother like a servant, and her like a curse, and she didn't see enemies anymore. She saw a pack that was fractured by fear, a group of souls desperate for a leader who offered more than just the edge of a sword. She took a step forward, her voice ringing out across the plaza with a clarity that defied her internal terror. "I was cast out by lies, but I stand here by choice," she proclaimed, her words a silver arrow aimed at the heart of their prejudice. Because she had chosen to stay, the air seemed to shift, the hostility of the pack softening into a begrudging, startled respect. They saw a woman who didn't kneel to the Alpha but stood as his equal, a sight that challenged every ancient law they had ever known. Kael's hand tightened on hers, a silent thank you for the courage he knew she was bleeding to find. The commitment was made, the lines in the dirt were drawn in permanent ink, and for a fleeting heartbeat, Elara felt a peace she hadn't known since she was a child. But peace in a world of wolves is often just the eye of the storm, a brief reprieve before the wind returns to tear everything down. Suddenly, the ground beneath them groaned as a series of concussive blasts rocked the perimeter of the village, sending plumes of black smoke into the twilight air. The peace was shattered by the rhythmic beat of war drums, the sound echoing through the valley like a titan's heartbeat. The public stand had drawn the enemy out, just as they had feared, and the scent of ozone and silver began to choke the evening breeze. Elara looked at Kael, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw the sudden, sharp alarm in his eyes. The world wasn't just coming for them, it was already here, and it had brought the darkness of the rival Alpha with it. Chapter 14. The Shadow of the Raven. The chaos that erupted in the plaza was a sensory overload of screaming, shifting bone, and the whistling of silver-tipped arrows. Kael was a blur of motion, barking orders to his commanders while shielding Elara with his own body, his eyes flashing a lethal gold as he scanned the treeline for the source of the attack. Transitioning from a moment of triumph to a frantic battle for survival, the Blackthorn warriors formed a protective circle around the dais, but the enemy was already inside the gates. Silas hadn't sent an army. He had sent a strike team of shadows, assassins trained to move through the darkness like ghosts through a graveyard. Because the rival Alpha knew that Kael's greatest weakness was now standing right beside him, the assault was designed as a distraction, a bloody sleight of hand to isolate the prize. Elara felt a sudden, freezing chill against her neck, the smell of damp earth and old blood filling her nostrils as a hand clamped over her mouth. She tried to scream, her fingers clawing for the silver dagger in her boot, but a needle-sharp pain exploded in her side as a tranquilizer hit her system. The world began to tilt, the faces of the warriors blurring into a smear of gray and orange, and the sound of Kael's frantic roar felt like it was coming from a different universe. "Kael!" She tried to gasp, but the word died in her throat as the darkness rushed in to meet her. She felt herself being hoisted into the air, the rhythmic jarring of a fast-moving horse the last thing she registered before the light vanished entirely. She was no longer a strategist or a queen. She was a captive, a weapon being returned to the man who had orchestrated her ruin a decade ago. The trauma of abandonment flared in her mind like a dying star, a cold voice whispering that Kael would eventually realize she wasn't worth the war it would take to get her back. Kael watched the Shadow Riders disappear into the forest, his heart shattering as he realized he had failed the only vow that mattered. He didn't care about the burning village or the wounded warriors. He only cared about the empty space where Elara had stood a moment before. Transitioning from a leader to a frantic hunter, he shifted into his massive wolf form, his howl of agony and rage echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed to make the stars themselves tremble. He had spent his life fearing that love would destroy him, and now he was living through the very nightmare he had tried to outrun. The pack watched their Alpha with a mixture of terror and pity, seeing the ruthless king reduced to a wounded beast. He didn't wait for a rescue party or a strategy. He launched himself into the woods, his paws tearing up the frozen earth as he followed the scent of cedar and lavender that was fading into the night. Silas had played his hand, and the stakes were now higher than Kael's crown or the survival of his line. He would find her, or he would die trying. But the man who returned from this hunt would never be the one who had started it. The open loop of his fear had finally tightened around his throat, and the only way to breathe again was to kill the man who had stolen his heir. Chapter 15. The Cage of Silver. Elara woke to the sound of dripping water and the rhythmic clanking of chains, her head throbbing with a dull, rhythmic pain that made the world spin. She was suspended from a stone wall in a room that tasted of salt and iron, her wrists bound in shackles of pure silver that burned into her skin like branding irons. This was the rival compound, a fortress built on the suffering of those Silas deemed useful. And as she looked around the shadows, she felt the crushing weight of her predicament. Because she was a healer, the silver didn't just hurt. It acted like a dampener on her very soul, cutting her off from the mate bond and the golden energy that usually hummed in her blood. Transitioning from a captive to a defiant witness, she watched as Silas stepped out of the darkness, his eyes as cold and vacant as a winter moon. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a statesman, his clothing impeccable and his smile as sharp as a razor. "You look so much like your mother when she realized the pack wouldn't save her," he purred, his voice a smooth, oily caress that made Elara's skin crawl. He reached out to touch the silver chain, the metal hissing as it came into contact with her skin, a sound that made her teeth ache. He wasn't there to kill her. He was there to break her, to turn her into the ultimate asset for his expansion. "Kael is coming for me!" she spat, her voice raspy but filled with a defiance that surprised even her. She wouldn't let him see the terror that was clawing at her insides, the fear that Silas was right about her unworthiness. Silas laughed, a hollow, dry sound that echoed through the damp cell, his expression turning to one of mock pity. "Kael is a king, Elara, and kings know how to calculate the cost of a war," he countered, leaning in until his breath fanned her cheek. "He will be told that he can have peace and his pack's survival, or he can have a broken girl. What do you think he will choose when the silver starts to fly?" Because the seed of doubt had been planted in her mind for a decade, Elara felt the darkness of his words begin to take root. Would Kael really sacrifice everything he had built for a woman who was technically an exile and a liability? She saw the logic in the betrayal, the cold, hard arithmetic of leadership that she had seen Kael use a dozen times before. The shackles felt heavier now, not just because of the silver, but because of the weight of her own insecurity. She was alone in the dark, chained by a man who saw her as a trophy, and her only hope was a mate who might decide she was too expensive to keep. The night deepened, the silence of the cell broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant, mocking howls of Silas's wolves. Elara closed her eyes, trying to find the thread of the bond in the static of the silver, reaching out with a desperate hope for the man who had promised she wouldn't be hunted alone. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the belief that she was worthy of being rescued. As the first light of a cold dawn began to filter through the high barred window, she knew that the decision Kael made would define the rest of her existence. Chapter 16. The Threshold of Desolation. The forest surrounding the rival compound was a graveyard of twisted shadows and frozen mist, a landscape that mirrored the jagged shards of Kael's fracturing composure. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his massive wolf form vibrating with a silent, lethal tension that made the air around him feel heavy and ionized. Every instinct he possessed screamed for him to tear through the stone walls, to paint the earth in Silas's blood, until his mate was back in his arms. Transitioning from a frantic hunter to a desperate king, Kael felt the suffocating weight of his crown pressing against his skull as his scouts reported the sheer scale of the ambush awaiting him. Silas hadn't just taken Elara. He had turned the entire fortress into a silver-lined death trap, designed to force a choice that no leader should ever have to make. Because he knew that a direct assault would result in a massacre of his remaining warriors, Kael felt the icy grip of hesitation paralyze his heart. He looked at the high, jagged parapets where Silas's archers stood like gargoyles, their arrows tipped with the very metal that could end his life in a single heartbeat. If he claimed her, war would erupt on a scale that would leave the northern territories a scorched wasteland of ash and bone. If he rejected her, if he walked away and left her to the mercy of a man who saw her as a biological resource, she might live, but she would be a prisoner of a different kind of darkness forever. The arithmetic of leadership was a cold, cruel master, and for the first time in his life, Kael found himself unable to solve the equation. The scent of cedar and lavender was faint here, choked by the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of the silver chains he knew were biting into Elara's skin. He shifted back into his human form, his naked skin steaming in the frigid air, his eyes never leaving the iron-bound gates of the compound. His commanders watched him with a mixture of pity and expectation, waiting for the order that would determine their fate. He was a man torn between the duty he owed to his people and the soul-deep need to protect the only person who had ever seen past his mask of frost. The open loop of his core fear was finally closing. He was standing on the precipice of losing everything he loved because he was too afraid of the cost of keeping it. Chapter 17. The Ceremony of Rejection. Inside the central courtyard of the fortress, the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the mocking laughter of Silas's pack. Elara was dragged from her cell, her feet stumbling over the uneven stones, her silver shackles clanking a mournful rhythm that echoed against the high walls. She was forced to stand at the center of a circle of snarling wolves, her gaze fixed on the heavy gates where she knew Kael was waiting. Transitioning from a captive to a sacrificial lamb, she saw Silas step onto the balcony above her, his face illuminated by a dozen flickering torches like a demon in a cathedral. He raised a hand for silence, the sound of his voice cutting through the wind like a serrated blade. "People of the north, behold the mate of the great Blackthorn Alpha," Silas proclaimed, his words dripping with a calculated, oily venom. "A woman cast out by her own blood, a healer whose power is wasted on a tyrant who cannot even protect his own borders." He looked down at Elara with a sneer that made her stomach turn, his eyes gleaming with the triumph of a man who had already won the psychological war. He announced that the hour had come for the public rejection ceremony, a formal ritual that would sever the bond and leave Elara as a stateless asset for whoever had the strength to take her. The humiliation of her past was being replayed on a grander, more lethal stage, and Elara felt the familiar coldness of unworthiness begin to freeze her heart. Because she could feel the bond through the static of the silver, she knew the exact moment Kael stepped through the gates, his presence a dark morning shadow in the torchlight. He walked alone, his head bowed, his posture that of a man who had already been defeated by the weight of his own crown. Elara watched him, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the weariness in his eyes, the way he wouldn't even look her in the face. Her deepest fear, that he would eventually decide she wasn't worth the sacrifice, was manifesting in the cold, hard reality of the courtyard. She stood tall, her chin trembling but her eyes dry, preparing herself for the final abandonment that would break what was left of her spirit. Chapter 18. The Eclipse of the Heart. Kael stepped into the center of the circle, the silence of the gathered wolves so profound that the crackle of the torches sounded like thunder. He looked at Silas, then finally, agonizingly, his gaze shifted to Elara, who stood chained and bleeding in the dirt. The bond between them screamed, a frantic, agonizing pull that tried to bridge the gap of silver and pride, but Kael's expression remained a mask of hollow resignation. Transitioning from a partner to a stranger, he took a breath that seemed to rattle in his chest, his voice a low, flat rasp that carried to the furthest corners of the courtyard. "The pack cannot survive a war of this magnitude for the sake of one woman," he stated, the words falling like lead weights into the silence. The shock of his statement rippled through the crowd, a collective gasp that felt like a physical blow to Elara's chest. She felt the world tilt, the torchlight blurring into a smear of orange as her core belief screamed its final, terrible truth. You are fundamentally unworthy. She had allowed herself to believe, for a few fleeting weeks, that she was more than a weapon or a shame. only to be discarded in the most public and humiliating way possible. Because she had expected this, the pain was a familiar, cold companion, a dark tide that rose to swallow her whole. She looked at the silver chains on her wrists and realized that they were the only things keeping her upright, as her soul began to collapse into the abyss. Kael walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, the wolves of Silas's pack parting for him like a sea of gray fur. He stopped inches from her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. He reached out to touch the silver collar at her neck, the metal hissing against his skin as he ignored the burn, his fingers trembling with a hidden, frantic energy. The silence stretched until it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing, a moment of absolute darkness before the final strike. Elara closed her eyes, waiting for the words of rejection that would sever her from the world forever, her heart a cold stone in the center of the storm. "Do it, King." Silas mocked from the balcony, his voice filled with a sickening, triumphant glee. "Reject the girl and save your kingdom, or claim her and watch your world burn." Kael didn't look up. He only looked at Elara, his hand tightening on the silver until the smell of his own scorched flesh filled her nostrils. The question of destiny versus decision hung in the air, a final, lethal hook that threatened to tear them both apart. As the darkness of the all-is-lost moment reached its zenith, the only thing Elara could hear was the frantic, desperate thud of her own heart, beating out a rhythm of failure in the shadow of the man she had almost dared to love. Chapter 19. The Revolution of the Knee. The atmosphere in the courtyard was thick with the scent of Kael's burning flesh as he gripped Elara's silver collar, a sound like a dying ember hissing in the snow. Silas leaned over the balcony, his eyes wide with a predatory hunger, waiting for the words that would officially render Elara a masterless prize. Transitioning from a man defeated by his crown to a man defined by his heart, Kael didn't speak the words of rejection that everyone expected. Instead, he let out a jagged, rattling breath and began to lower his body, his movements slow and agonizingly deliberate. The silence of the gathered wolves turned into a collective, stunned gasp as the most ruthless alpha in the Northern Territories let his knees hit the frozen dirt at Elara's feet. Because he knew that true dominance was a hollow victory without the woman who gave his life meaning, Kael's act of public submission was a thunderclap that shattered the ancient laws of the pack. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck to her, the ultimate sign of a wolf surrendering his life to another. "I do not claim you because fate demands it," he rasped, his voice vibrating through the stone beneath them. "I kneel because without you, there is no kingdom worth ruling." This was the reversal of every humiliation Elara had ever endured, a king offering his pride as a sacrifice to the woman the world had deemed unworthy. The emotional impact hit Elara like a physical wave, the cold walls around her heart finally crumbling into dust under the weight of his devotion. She looked down at the man who had terrified nations, now a humble supplicant in the dirt for the sake of her soul. Transitioning from a broken captive to a woman awakened, she felt the golden energy in her blood begin to boil, a white-hot heat that defied the dampening power of the silver shackles. She didn't need a savior. She needed a partner who recognized her worth, and in the shadow of Kael's submission, her own power finally found its voice. The question of her worthiness was answered not by a decree from the stars, but by the choice of the man kneeling before her. Chapter 20. The blood-marked covenant. Silas's scream of fury from the balcony was lost in the sudden, deafening roar of the Blackthorn warriors who had breached the outer perimeter, their hearts ignited by their alpha's display of raw, unfiltered love. Kael stood up, his eyes no longer gold, but a blinding, incandescent amber that signaled the total merging of the man and the beast. He reached for Elara, his teeth flashing in the torchlight as he leaned in, not for a kiss, but for the sacred mark of a permanent bond. He bit into the sensitive curve of her neck, the sting of the puncture followed by a rush of heat that felt like a sun exploding in her veins. He was claiming her before the world, marking her as his equal, his mate, and his sovereign. Because the bond was now fully forged and anchored by mutual choice, the silver shackles on Elara's wrists began to glow with a frantic internal light. She let out a cry that was half sob and half warrior's yell, her power surging through the metal until the chains fractured and sprayed across the courtyard like glass. She was free, her healing blood now a weapon of pure, restorative light that made the nearby rival wolves recoil in terror. Transitioning from the victim of a hunt to the goddess of the battlefield, she stood back to back with Kael, her skin glowing with a faint, ethereal radiance. The war had erupted, but it was no longer a slaughter, it was a revolution. The courtyard became a symphony of violence and grace as the two alphas moved in a lethal, coordinated dance of teeth and blade. Kael was a cyclone of fur and fury, his claws tearing through Silas's elite guard with a speed that defied the eye, while Elara moved with a fluid, lethal precision, her touch mending Kael's wounds as fast as they appeared. They were equal, a dual-headed dragon of light and shadow that turned the tide of the battle in a matter of heartbeats. Every time a silver blade tasted Kael's skin, Elara's energy was there to knit it back together, making him essentially immortal as long as she stood beside him. The climb was reaching its final peak, and the view from the top was painted in the crimson of their enemies. Chapter 21. The Equalizer's Descent. Transitioning from the chaos of the melee to the singular focus of the climax, Kael and Elara tracked Silas as he tried to retreat toward the inner sanctum of the fortress. He was a coward who ruled through shadows, and in the brilliant light of their united bond, he had nowhere left to hide. They cornered him on the high battlements, the wind howling around them as the first flakes of a winter storm began to fall. Silas looked at them, his face a mask of frantic terror, realizing too late that he hadn't been fighting a king and his mate, but a single, unbreakable force of nature. Because he had tried to use their love as a weakness, he had inadvertently given them the strength to destroy him. "You thought her blood was a prize to be stolen," Kael growled, his voice a primal sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. He took a step forward, his shadow looming over the rival alpha, but he didn't deliver the killing blow. He stepped aside, looking at Elara with a profound respect that was the final piece of her healing. This was her battle, her vengeance, and her right to claim the justice the world had denied her mother. Elara stepped forward, the silver dagger she had reclaimed from Silas's belt glowing with a soft golden light that hummed in her palm. The final push wasn't just about ending a life, it was about reclaiming her agency from the man who had tried to steal it before she was even born. She looked into Silas's cold, dead eyes and saw the personification of every lie she had ever believed about herself. "You said I was a weapon," she whispered, her voice steady and lethal as she raised the blade. "But I am the hand that wields it." She struck with a speed that ended the war in a single, clean stroke, her power flaring one last time as Silas's body slumped against the cold stone. The climb was complete, the enemy was gone, and as she turned back to Kael, the silence of the falling snow felt like the first true peace of her life. Chapter 22. The Refusal of the Crown. The smoke from the rival compound drifted lazily into a sky now clear and crystalline, the harsh winter sun reflecting off the pristine snow that blanketed the battlefield. Transitioning from the adrenaline of slaughter to the heavy stillness of victory, Elara stood on the ramparts and watched the Blackthorn warriors begin the grim work of gathering their fallen. The world felt different now, the colors sharper and the air tasting of a freedom she had never permitted herself to imagine. Because the victory had been won through a partnership of equals, the traditional hierarchy of the pack felt like a garment that had become too small and restrictive for the people they had become. Kael stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, no longer a tyrant gripping a prize, but a man supporting his heart. A delegation of the Blackthorn elders approached, their silver hair catching the morning light as they knelt before the couple, their faces etched with a profound, humbled reverence. They carried a heavy velvet cushion bearing the Alpha's mate coronet, a delicate circlet of silver and moonstone designed to be worn 3 steps behind the king. Transitioning from a moment of ritual to a profound systemic shift, the head matron looked up at Elara, her voice trembling with the weight of her realization. "The prophecy of the healer has been fulfilled," she stated, her tone devoid of the bitterness that had once defined it. "Will you accept this crown and take your place as the Alpha's shadow, protecting our line from the darkness?" Elara looked at the beautiful, fragile thing on the cushion and felt a strange, detached sort of pity for the woman she used to be. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool metal, before she slowly shook her head, the refusal sending a shockwave of whispers through the gathered crowd. "I will not be a shadow, and I will not be a mate whose power is used only to preserve the past," she said, her voice carrying a resonance that made the nearby trees shiver. She looked at Kael, and for the first time in the history of their people, the Alpha didn't look offended. He looked like he was witnessing the dawn. Because she had found her own worth in the fire, she would never again settle for a title that required her to kneel. Chapter 23. The Dawn of the Dual Throne. The Great Hall of Blackthorn was filled to capacity, but the atmosphere was no longer one of judgment or fear. It was a sanctuary of expectant silence. Kael stood before the high thrones, but he had ordered the second chair, the one traditionally reserved for guests or heirs, to be moved until it sat perfectly flush with his own. Transitioning from the old law to the new reality, he turned to face his people, his voice a steady, unbreakable vow that echoed into the rafters. "We have ruled through strength and survived through fear for generations," he proclaimed, his gaze sweeping over the warriors and healers alike. "But strength without healing is just a slow way to die, and a king without an equal is just a prisoner in a golden cage." He reached for Elara's hand, leading her to the twin seats of power, and together they sat as the first co-alphas in the history of the Northern Territories. The act was a bridge between the physical dominance of the wolf and the spiritual resilience of the healer, a synthesis that promised a future where no one would be discarded for the crime of being different. Transitioning from a woman of shame to a sovereign of choice, Elara felt the golden energy of her blood merge with the deep, grounding pulse of the pack's collective soul. They were no longer two separate entities trying to survive a bond. They were a singular force of governance, a dual throne that recognized the necessity of both the sword and the balm. Because the peace was negotiated through a position of absolute power, the surrounding packs quickly fell into line, terrified and fascinated by the new order. Elara spent her days not in the shadows of the nursery, but in the war room and the infirmary, proving that a leader could be both lethal and compassionate. She watched the children of the pack play in the plaza, seeing the way they looked at her with hope instead of suspicion, and she knew that the cycle of humiliation had been broken. The emotional question that had haunted her life was finally answered. She was worthy not because fate had chosen her, but because she had the courage to choose herself. Chapter 24. The Sanctuary of the Soul. The small cabin in the woods was exactly as they had left it, the broken door now replaced with sturdy cedar and the scent of lavender once again fighting the smell of the pines. Transitioning from the heavy responsibilities of the throne to the quiet intimacy of their private sanctuary, Elara and Kael returned to the place where their storm had first begun. The forest was silent, the only sound the crackle of a fire in the hearth and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the man she loved. Because they had built a world that no longer required them to be monsters, the cabin had transformed from a tomb of her past into a temple of their future. Kael lay sprawled across the bed, his golden eyes soft as he watched Elara brush out her hair by the light of a singular candle. He looked peaceful, the jagged lines of tension that had once defined his face finally smoothed away by the certainty of her presence. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at her was a conversation in itself, a long, slow poem of gratitude and desire. Elara put down the brush and moved to the bed, sliding into the heat of his embrace, her head resting on the chest that had once been a wall and was now her home. She no longer feared the silence or the darkness, because she knew that no matter what hunters waited in the woods, she would never face them alone. The moon hung full and silver over the cabin, a silent witness to the woman who had inherited a broken shack and found a kingdom in the arms of a ruthless king. Transitioning from a story of fate to a story of volition, Elara closed her eyes and let the warmth of the bond pull her into a dreamless sleep. She wasn't a weapon. She wasn't a victim. And she wasn't a shadow. She was a woman who had stood at the edge of the world and decided to stay. Not because the world deserved her, but because she deserved to be seen. The final resolution was a simple, quiet truth. She had always been worthy. And now, for the first time in her life, she was finally home.